Today is obviously the commemoration of the day 4 coordinated attacks in the United States were carried out, orchestrated by Al-Qaeda and their funders and enablers within the government of this government's alleged allies, Saudi Arabia, in 2001. Now, the government is constantly indoctrinating us to never forget 9/11, ostensibly to honor the 2,977 deaths, over 25,000 injuries, and the countless and ongoing long-term health complications suffered by survivors and first responders who incidentally had to fight this government to receive compensation to deal with those health complications over. But what most people don't know is that a lot more is connected to this date than just what happened in this country in 2001. And it is all incredibly important. On this day in 1977, Stephen Biko was beaten to death in the back of a police van by apartheid forces in South Africa. Biko was the founder of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa that spread from university campuses into urban Black communities throughout the country. In 1972, Biko was one of the founders of the Black People's Convention, an umbrella organization of Black consciousness groups. And he was arrested 4 times over the next 2 years for his activism, and he was held without trial for months at a time. On August 18, 1977, he and a fellow activist were seized at a roadblock and jailed in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Biko was found naked and shackled outside a hospital in Pretoria. He died in the early morning hours of September 12, 1977. The South African government denied their involvement in Biko's murder for years, although the Afrikaner police officers who murdered him admitted to the killing in 1997 before the country's post-apartheid Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The United States government continued its support of the brutal and murderous apartheid regime of South Africa until the late 1980s, focusing on the minerals that trade with the country benefited the U.S. government while ignoring the gross human rights abuses committed against the indigenous African people at the hands of the racist descendants of Dutch colonizers. Then on this day in 1990, anthropologist Myrna Mac Chang was murdered in Guatemala by U.S.-backed military forces due to her outspoken criticism of the Guatemalan government's treatment of the indigenous Mayan people. See, Maya had begun to expose and document the destruction of rural indigenous communities in Guatemala, which the U.S.-backed state forces and allied paramilitary groups were responsible for, as they committed myriad human rights violations, including attacks against entire indigenous populations, utterly wiping them out during the Civil War that began in 1954 when the CIA backed a military coup against the democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz was considered a communist threat by the U.S., but his real crime was that he attempted to nationalize the vast plantation state that was the United Fruit Company. Even though the U.S. was aware of the brutal campaign against so-called counterinsurgencies in Guatemala in the 36-year civil war that the coup sparked, that resulted in over nearly 200,000 civilian deaths at the hands of the Guatemalan army, U.S. military and economic aid and covert intelligence continued to flow from the U.S. to the Guatemalan government for 30 years. On September 11, 1990, Myrna Mac was stabbed 27 times by the death squad from the Presidential High Command. Her sister, Helen, fought for justice for her and all victims of the High Command, and on November 25, 2003, the Guatemalan court ruled that Myrna Mac had been killed by government forces. And in April 2004, following the judgment issued by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the Guatemalan government publicly acknowledged that its agents had committed the murder of Myrna Mac. And then there was September 11th in 1993. In the midst of one of several U.S.-backed coups in Haiti, Antoine Ismeti, a Haitian businessman who had thrown in his lot with the Social Democrat Party Lavalas, was dragged out of a church by U.S.-backed coup forces. He was murdered in the street in broad daylight. He had been commemorating a massacre of parishioners at the St. John Bosco Church that had occurred 5 years to the day before, on September 11, 1988. At the time, Father Jean-Bertrand Aristide was in the church. He narrowly escaped death in that attack, and he later became the first democratically elected president of Haiti, who was then overthrown and exiled by U.S.-backed coup forces twice because the U.S. didn't want to risk Aristide's humanitarian and liberation theology-focused ideology influencing the rest of the region and believing that they could be free from U.S. imperialism. And finally, but probably most importantly, there was the assassination of Salvador Allende in Chile that set the stage for the first full implementation of the neoliberal experiment in the modern era. South America, and in particular the Latin cone countries, were challenging American corporate domination of their natural resource mining industries with policies of developmentalism, which emphasized nationalized economic policies to address inequality and poverty in their country. Campaigning on the promise of those policies, socialist Salvador Allende won the 1970 Chilean election by a slim majority in a three-way race, which was ultimately decided by the Chilean Congress. Upon taking office, Allende nationalized key industries to benefit education, housing, and healthcare for the people, and they started to show immediate economic improvement. Inflation fell by a third by 1971 over the previous year, while wages rose on average by 22%, and minimum increases for blue-collar workers rose by 56%. But Allende's victory for the people was seen as a disaster by the U.S. government and its imperialist geopolitical interests. President Nixon approved $10 million for the CIA to stop Allende's reforms. The U.S. began sowing dissent within the Chilean government against Allende, resulting in a failed coup attempt on June 29, 1973. But on September 11, 1973, coup forces led by Augusto Pinochet surrounded the presidential palace with U.S.-bought tanks and fighter jets. Allende was offered safe passage to another country, but he refused, determined to stay and fight for his country and people. Shortly after his last radio address to the nation, the coup plotters took to the airwaves and announced that Allende had conveniently committed suicide. Now, that narrative has been challenged over the years, but it was allegedly ruled official by a court in 2011. But you know I don't believe that, and neither should you. Not only did the democratically elected president of Chile die on September 11th, 1973, but so did democracy in that and other Latin cone countries within the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism. Freedom died in Chile under Pinochet, as at least 27,255 people were tortured, 2,279 people executed, at least that were able to be documented during his regime. In addition, some 200,000 people suffered exile, and an unknown number went through clandestine centers and illegal detentions. And on that day, the neoliberal project developed by the Chicago boys, who were trained by U.S. economist Milton Friedman, was born and unleashed upon the world. They were called the Chicago boys because they all came from the University of Chicago. We live every bit of all of this bloody legacy of U.S. imperialism and neoliberalism in these countries and right here in this one to this day. Follow Lukman Nation on patreon.com for lots of great content.